Welcome back for another edition of Discussing Serial. I'm Amber Corrin with Federal Times, today joined by Army Times Managing Editor Tony Lombardo. Thanks for being back, Tony.
Thank you.
In episode 9 of Serial, called Trade Secrets, we get an intriguing glimpse into the activities behind the rescue of Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl in 2014, nearly 5 years after he walked off his post and into Taliban captivity. In this episode, we learn that Bergdahl was one part of a much more complex picture of U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, foreign relations between the two countries, and the labyrinth of diplomatic efforts going on at the time. So, Tony, what did you think about the episode?
I'm going to be honest with you. Didn't really like the episode that much. I thought it was kind of a placeholder when I really wanted to get back to more revelations about Bergdahl, and honestly, I'm still waiting to hear that from this season. But the one interesting takeaway for me was that Bergdahl was a line item in these negotiations that spanned years. I mean, we're talking literally years that Bowe's release was tied to some potential release of Taliban members who were in Gitmo. So that was the one key takeaway for me. What do you think?
That was a key takeaway. He was a line item in a much broader negotiation. But I disagree with you. I think that this episode, I thought it was really interesting, and I thought it gave us a really good glimpse into this very fraught and fragile, as they described it, very fraught and fragile diplomatic process that almost was brought down many times over. The death of Richard Holbrooke in 2010, he was a key diplomat that was brokering deals over there, and it was huge. When he died, a lot of things fell apart. We had this debacle with setting up Taliban offices in Doha, Qatar, and they had to have the right signage, and the signage was wrong. John Kerry had to swoop in, but then President Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan was still very unhappy with it. They basically had to start back over again. So it was obviously this very fragile process, and I thought it gave us a really good glimpse into that, because usually we don't see that except on, like Homeland on TV. So
I guess I was just extremely skeptical at the parts of the show where it's like, well, if we almost had peace and the war was almost over because of this diplomacy, I just didn't really buy that argument, and I think it simplified what actually was going on.
There was, I think I agree that there was, some oversimplification of things, but I think that they were trying to cast light on, this complicated back channeling that's happening, behind the scenes. The American public doesn't necessarily know that much about it, and it really showed the fragility of the peacemaking process. And here we are 14 years later, and we still aren't there. So I thought it was really interesting in that aspect. We also got a really interesting teaser at the end of the episode for next week's episode. And we hear about Bergdahl's parents being assured that Bergdahl wouldn't face charges, that his time in captivity was punishment enough, and that they probably really wouldn't need a military lawyer. They were led to believe that when Obama came out in the Rose Garden announcing his rescue, that it was mission accomplished. Now we know that's really not the case. So what happened there?
I think the White House did not anticipate the monumental blowback they were going to get at the idea of this trade of 5 Gitmo prisoners for 1 U.S. soldier. And so, I do think next week should be a much more interesting episode, so I'm looking forward to hearing it.
So I think the next episode promises to delve more into what came next after Bergdahl's rescue. We'll be back on March 18th to talk about the latest in the Serial podcast. Until then, as always, we welcome your comments and thoughts on our stories at federaltimes.com, in my email at acorrin@federaltimes.com, or on Twitter at CorrinAmber. Thanks for joining us.